Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Hum, a Kansas Hoops podcast via the Field of 68. I'm Sam Lance with Jackson Bezdek, as always, and we got a busy schedule today on today's episode. We're going to be going over the K-State game. We're going to be kind of quickly looking at TCU and at the Big 12 standings, and then Evan Miya, a college basketball analytics guy, is going to be joining us for the back half of the show. So stay tuned, y'all. Episode 59 of The Hum coming right up next. All right, Bez. Kansas beating the rival Kansas State 84-74 inside of Allen Fieldhouse. It was a 20-4 run to start the game, including a 14-0 spurt where Zeke Mayo just went absolutely crazy. But then the second half kind of happened. Kansas State got it within 6 points with 4 minutes to go, and then again with 1 minute to go. But it was all just kind of too late for Kansas State. Kansas ends up walking out with the 84-74 win. And honestly, what was just probably one of the weirder games of the entire season. Bez, what are just your first thoughts from this one?
My first thoughts are I think we have to take everything we saw with a grain of salt in this game because I mean K-State is really bad, Sam. They are not a good basketball team. And the fact that, you get off to a 24 start and then the rest of the game K-State beats you. I mean, K-State beat Kansas for about 32 minutes of that game. And that's something a lot of people aren't going to look at and talk about, but it's true. The last 32 minutes were not good from Kansas, and that's way too much time to dick around with a bad team. And a lot of other Big 12 opponents, that's not going to fly. And I think KJ being out exposed a lot of what was wrong defensively. Like Kansas had that great defensive identity for 3 or 4 games there. A lot of that has to do with KJ Adams being a huge part of that and being the anchor inside. And Hunter got exposed on pick and rolls numerous times. Zeke Mayo got back cut slash lost his man 4 or 5 times in the second half. It was getting to the point where I was almost about to track how many points he was giving up because of how good he was offensively. I'm like, well, it's not going to matter if you're going to give up 22, Zeke. So that was kind of what I took from it. I didn't love how they played. The start was great, and then they just took the foot off the gas pedal, it seemed like, and I'm not really sure why.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to start with Hunter Dickinson. Obviously, the last episode we kind of ripped him a little bit, and really kind of the general consensus, like after that Iowa State game that I was seeing from a bunch of fans is, oh man, we're done with Hunter. Like we're done with this. We're done with this. He kind of responded in this one with a great game, and we're gonna get into an interesting conversation with Evan Miya later in this podcast about how Hunter Dickinson actually is a good defender. I'm curious to hear what he has to say about that. But in this game, Hunter Dickinson played offensively like he was 7'2", which is what Bill Self was wanting him to do. 25 points in this one, 8 rebounds, 3 assists. He's 12 and 19 from the floor. I believe he scored like 10 of Kansas's first, however many points during that start to the game. Bez, what did you just kind of make of Hunter Dickinson's performance statistically, putting up some numbers here?
Yeah, I mean that's good to see, right? It's good to see the ball go through the hole. It's been a while. I mean, it's been since UCF since Hunter's had a Hunter game, so that was needed for him going forward. It's just, Coleman Hawkins and David Gasson, like those aren't, you know, great interior defenders. They're just not. So, like I said, relax on all of the overreactions of Kansas is back and Hunter's figured it out. I can't say that until I see it against an actual opponent, and that's not K-State. And I don't think it's TCU either. Now, Ernest Uday, the center for TCU, right, that we'll get into later, like that could be interesting because Ernest is a big guy. He's not afraid to get physical, but at the same time, Hunter should go for 22 and 10. 100% he should go for 22 and 10 over Ernest. And I love Big Ernie, but that's just the reality of the situation. And, to kind of go to Evan's point that, you'll talk about with him later, I really do feel like that's skewed with KJ. Like, I think KJ is making those numbers look good because eye test, it's horrible defender. Like we both know that. We watch these games. We
I
see him.
think I think he's gotten a lot better. I will say he's gotten a lot better, but there's still a lot of moments that you're
Right.
left scratching your head. But I do think Hunter has gotten better on that end of the floor.
And maybe those moments, those head scratcher moments are so bad it makes it seem a lot more, a lot bigger than what's actually happening. But I think KJ is really like skewing those numbers for Hunter, where, you know, Hunter's able to not get back as quick because KJ's back there. And then KJ can take the roll man and Hunter can dive down to the opposite block and take that guy. In that case, that guy is usually 6'7" or 6'8". Now that guy's trying to post up Hunter Dickinson. That's Hunter's way bigger than that. So Hunter's just got to go straight up and he's fine. So there's a lot of different things that I'd be interested to see the KJ off on numbers defensively, what that does for the Jayhawks. But at the same time, the offense was flowing without KJ in there.
Yeah, well, we'll kind of get to the KJ, KU with no KJ stuff here in a second. I want to talk about Flory getting the start in this game. I mean, I think, Self before the game was like, I got it down to 3 or 4. I think it was going to be Flory the entire time. The only problem with that is you don't really have anybody to relieve the
Right.
big men, right?
Right.
Like if you're starting two bigs, guess what? Clemens is hurt, KJ's hurt. You don't have another big behind him. So I thought it was just interesting this self quote after the game and kind of why Flory got the start. He said, "quote Our best team analytically, regardless of who's in the game." The best combination is Flory and Hunter when you talk about points per possession offensively and points given up defensively. What do you just think of the combo Flory Hunter? Do we see this the rest of the time KJ Adams is going to be out, and do you want to see it?
Heck
Wow.
yeah, I do. I love Flory. Put that guy in there. Give him 30 minutes. I mean, that might have been a matchup thing with K-State, right? They got Hawkins, Gasson, two bigger guys. You kind of got to match that because, dude, when AJ was getting switched on Coleman Hawkins, that was baby food for Coleman, dude. Like there was just a couple matchups where it's like, we gotta have two bigs in the game. So, you get a four guard lineup. Does Flory start in that still? I still think he should because I think there's a good chance one of those four guards isn't exactly a Allen Iverson with the handle, and you can put Flory on that guy because Flory's really athletic and can move. But I would like to see it. I love Flory. I love his energy. He is he's not there yet offensively in terms of like having a bag, right? He's still very raw, but he still is very active around the rim and he can, you can give it to him in the block and he can score. It's not like he's a zero when it comes to making post moves. He's just super raw, but I think that is helping his mentality of I have to do everything I possibly can because I might not get a shot outside of a lob dunk, right? So I'm going to be really active in everything else I do and that's something Kansas really, really needs right now.
Yeah, I thought Flory's play was great, especially during that start, grabbing some of those offensive rebounds at the beginning of the game. That was huge for the start here. The last thing to touch on, kind of with this K-State game, the two bigs lineup is what worked against Kansas State, right? Because they have the two bigs in Gassan and Coleman Hawkins. The KU starters in this game. I saw a tweet on this. It was they were plus 22 and the bench ended up being minus 10. So basically, playing two bigs plus 22, not playing two bigs minus 10. And a lot of it is just because of the matchup here. Again, Kansas State with the two bigs, AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin, and others. Rakis trying to guard four men, and four men who could probably play the five at some of these small ball schools. So I think it's just interesting to note moving forward because KU's going to be without KJ Adams for a little bit. Self updated his status yesterday on Hawk Talk. He said he'll miss a minimum of 3 to 4 games with that separated shoulder. The quote from Self, he said, "The doctors are all pleased. We talked to several of them, NFL, baseball, basketball, and what they thought with this particular injury. He's probably ahead of schedule, but we can't push making the ligament or the tender or the capsule heal faster. It's got to take its natural course." Uh, I believe with this, the minimum would be he would be back against UCF on at home next Tuesday, or the Baylor game on Saturday, February 1st. And then KU plays Iowa State again February 3rd at home for Big Monday. So you probably Really want KJ back for that one. Um, what do you think, Bez? 84 points, against Kansas State. It's the most in conference play besides UCF, but also allowed 74 points. Wasn't pretty defensive performance. What do we just think of no KJ? What do we think?
It's exactly that. It's the most points you've scored in conference play and and almost the most you've given up to one of the worst teams in the conference. Right? And that's exactly how a lot of people probably thought no KJ was going to go. Where yeah, it does kind of inherently solve some offensive problems, right? To where, Flory being a bigger force down there with Hunter offensively, Hunter's not going to get double teamed as much because that little bloop to Flory is very simple. And KJ has been struggling to make those. He just has, man. I mean, what's he like 3 for 9 last game, and he was 2 for 6
He
against
hasn't
like
been finishing through contact like he
he's
usually
not
does.
been finishing well. And Flory is going to put that thing through your face. He's going to dunk it. So that works. Spacing when we're only running one big, right? Just Hunter's in the game, just Flory's in the game. We actually saw the Dewan Zeke, AJ Ryland lineup a good amount, which was awesome to see because we never get to see that. So that was cool to see. But defensively, it was you could feel it. And it's not subbing Flory in for KJ is the problem because Flory is a good defender, right? He can block shots. He's going to get rebounds, which is something that KJ's been a lot better at lately is rebounding. But it's just little things, and I would have to go back and rewatch the game to really like find the intricacies of it. But it's little rotational things that Kansas was a touch slow on Saturday that just it didn't look a touch slow. It looked kind of a lot slow. And I think when KJ's in there, it hides that a little bit. Like you don't have to be 30 seconds, I'm right here when KJ's in the game because he can bail you out. But when he's not there, like guys, you got to lock in for 30 seconds every possession, and that's going to take a lot of effort. And I think that whole defensive identity thing, I think that was really, really tested on Saturday. And you know, TCU can get hot, man. It's a young team, but you don't know. They can get hot. And you got to be able to respond to that. And hopefully the offense keeps gelling and keeps flowing and they get out and transition more. The transition offense was phenomenal when they got into it. That needs to happen more because when KJ comes back, he's going right into 35 minutes. I mean, that's exactly what we know that is he is going right back into that lineup. So take advantage of this while you can. AJ, Ryland. I mean, Ryland didn't take a shot Saturday. Bizarre. He also didn't play a whole lot. Also bizarre. But this is your time to get going. So go get going.
I thought what I watched Could Be Wrong yesterday with Mike and Nick and the guys, and I thought something they said was very interesting. Basically, with KJ on the floor, like the offensive stuff, like isn't necessarily something you can fix, right? Like it's just it is what it is. Like you're limited. But with him off the floor, like the defensive stuff, like you talked about, the rotations, all that sort of stuff can be fixed,
Right? No,
right?
you're right. Yeah.
Like those are things that can be fixed. So I'm just I really think if we continue to see these next, three whatever games, Kansas continues to play well offensively, and if the defense gets better, with some of these other guys, then maybe that allows KJ to play less minutes, which is seems like what everybody wants. So that I thought that was a good take by the Could Be Wrong guys.
Totally. And, the fact that it was as glaring as it was at times in the second half, I have all the confidence in Self and Co. to get it worked out because they're right. Like, it is very fixable. It is as simple as you're over helping too much. We can't do that when KJ's not in because your guy cuts back door. KJ meets him at the block, except there's no KJ at the block on Saturday. So your guy just gets a layup. So it's just little things like that. It's not anything of you know, like Floyd can guard, right? Hunter is getting better. Zeke is trying. Dewan will guard. Shaq has been awesome. Like the individual defenders are fine. It's just the team defense is so anchored around KJ as it should be that now you have to, okay, we got to readjust a little bit what we've been doing.
Yeah,
They'll be
Kansas still has the number one defense on Torvik since the start of the new year by a lot. Like it's at like 83 point something, which
they've
I'm not
earned it.
exactly sure, but I think that would, if that was a season total, that would be historic. So Kansas is playing phenomenal defense right now, even with that performance. Let's move on to TCU a little bit. Kind of looking at TCU, it's kind of weird how similar analytically TCU is to Kansas. I mean, they got a bad offense, not a great offense, but great defense, and they're one of the worst free throw shooting teams in the country. We don't get to the line. Kansas doesn't get to the
That's
line
true.
at all.
That's true.
But TCU, they just don't make them very much. This is a thing that stands out to me, and I think this game will be a lot closer than people think. TCU's coming off a big win against Baylor. TCU is 5-1 in close games this year. 5-1. They've won pretty much all their close games. I think that'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, also got blown out by Arizona and Houston on the road, which is like that. Those are two pretty. I mean, Arizona is playing hotter than anybody right now, maybe, and Houston's one of the best teams in the conference. So, outside of those two games, they've been in every single good game, quote unquote. Right? They beat K-State, right? You beat BYU. That Baylor win, man, that was impressive. Baylor was winning pretty much the whole game, and TCU showed a ton of fight down the stretch, and my opinions on Baylor are one thing. Haven't seen them play pretty close in person, but I kind of like this TCU team, man. They get after it. They can guard, and when you play Kansas, like you have to be ready. These guards can get hot, and any team, it doesn't matter what their 3-point shooters shooting numbers are. You got to be ready for that. But they're going to get after it 100%. This team, I don't think is afraid of anybody. I think they just need more reps. Like I think this is going to be a team where it's like
They're young. This is the youngest team
yeah,
Jamie
like
Dixon
we
has
didn't
probably
have
ever
enough
had.
time this season. If the tournament was in April versus March, I think we might actually make it. But so they're not ready yet for the big stage, but they definitely have a lot of guys who think they are, and that's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, they got a win against Xavier, who's starting to piece it together here. They beat K-State by one. Uh, that's not great, but
And that I
they
watched
lost.
that game, and
Losing to
that was an ugly game.
Utah, not great. Losing to Santa Clara by 17. Not exactly great. So let's be honest, this is a win that Kansas should get. And I think their trio of guards, Frankie Collins, Vashon Alete, Noah Reynolds, KU should match up with those guards pretty well with Shaq, Zeke, and DeJuan. Should be able to kind of lock those guys up. And then Charzarian White, he's their four man. He's only 6'6". So, we talked about the Kansas State game. Those bench guys coming in, having to guard a big wasn't exactly the best recipe defensively. I think having, a guy like White who's only 6'6", that could help AJ Ryland see the floor a little bit more here. And then they got two freshman forwards, David Punch. I watched a game not too long ago, and David Punch kind of went off. And they also have this other freshman, Micah Robinson, who's pretty good. And then they have this like senior 6'8" guard. I forget his exact name, but we got to talk about Ernie just a little bit to close. He's leading the team in rebounds,
Damn right he is.
and blocks, and he's coming off a 16 point, 15 rebound, 4 block game against Baylor. I think he's going to be juiced to match up against Hunter Dickinson in Kansas.
Dude, he wants this one. He wants this one, man. I know he does, and I'm happy for him. I want him to want it. Excuse me. I'm a big Ernie guy. I was sad when he left, but like it is what it is. It's the new era of college sports. You can't get attached to these guys. They're gonna be gone in a year. And it's good to I'm glad he found his spot. I'm glad he's, putting up big numbers. But this is a great test for Hunter, right? You've got this kid who's going to be coming at your neck for 40 minutes. You know this going in. You have to have some type of competitive edge to you walking into this game. It's at their building, okay? That's another factor. Ernie's going to be fired up, juiced from the home crowd. You know it's going to be packed. Okay, they're a great defensive team. They're going to be super, super energetic for the first 10 minutes. If Hunter is 1 for 3 in the first 10 minutes, I don't really like Kansas's chances going forward unless one of the guards gets hot. If Hunter is 4 for 4 in the first 6 minutes, exactly. That's how you respond to this. Like it should be with the next tallest guy being 6'6". It's either Hunter or Flory needs to have some type of impact right away.
Yep.
If you start settling for shots, That's what TCU wants Kansas to do. Settle for as many jumpers as you guys want to take. Knock yourself out with that. I think you've got to establish Hunter inside. Because the thing with Ernie, if you let him think he's stopping Hunter, even for a little bit,
Confidence.
arms are coming up, the crowd's fired up, he's going to have a couple blocks. Avoid that, and you will be just fine.
I will say, the game before KU last year, he also had like a great game. He had 13 and 18 the game before KU. And then he put up 2 points, 4 rebounds against Kansas and what was only a 2 point loss for TCU. So if Ernie plays well in that game last year, could be a whole different story. I
Did he get
really
in
do
foul
think
trouble?
that
I don't
matchup.
remember him playing a whole lot. I think he got
Yeah,
in
he
foul
only
trouble.
played like 20 minutes. But it's going to be key that matchup down low between Ernie and Hunter. All right, guys, that's all we have for you today. We're going to be talking with Evan Miya here. I believe Bez is actually going to go coach. It'll be just me talking with Evan Miya, but we're going to pick his brain a little bit, see what he thinks of KU analytically, some of these lineups, because he has the lineup tool that I love looking at.
Yeah,
So
great.
stay tuned, y'all. We're going to have Evan coming right up next.
There is no sport in America that is more difficult to follow than college basketball. It can be overwhelming. That's where the Field of 68 Daily comes into play. The Daily is your go-to source for injury updates, recruiting news, and transfer portal additions that actually matter. For just $50 a year, get access to the same information that your favorite team's coaching staff is subscribed for. Quality content can be hard to find in the college basketball space. The Daily is here to help you with that.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Hum. And with us, we now have Evan Miya, a college basketball analytics expert, joining us to talk some KU basketball. Evan, how are you doing today?
We're doing great. It's a really fun time of year to be talking about basketball now that college football is officially over. So let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do it. First things first, Kansas Jayhawks. From the Kansas fan perspective, not necessarily the greatest year so far. Obviously, you lose to Mizzou, and that's never a good thing for KU people. And then recently, that loss to Iowa State. They also fell to Creighton on the road there. I just want first things first, just kind of your general thoughts on Kansas this season. Right now, the Jayhawks are number 7 on your website. Just what do you think of this team?
So here's the thing. I think for people who are expecting this team to be the best or one of the best top 3 teams in the country, so to speak, I think you can say, yeah, this has been a disappointing year. It definitely seems like Kansas is not in that upper echelon of those top elite teams. But if you're looking past that, I think they're right there. And they've improved a lot recently. I think I've had them definitely lower than 7th at previous points in the season. And I do think they are one of the top 10 teams in the country. And especially when you look at a year like last year where you only got a 4 seed and then lost early. This is going to be an improvement on last year, and Bill Self is one of the best coaches in the sport, and his teams often do really well in March. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism with this group, and so I don't think fans should be too down on them, to be honest.
Preseason is kind of how much of a fan were you of the roster construction by Bill Self, and how do you just think that's kind of played out with all these new pieces?
So here's the thing. Big picture, I was still really happy with the roster. I had this team, I think, 3rd in the preseason, which I think some Kansas fans would have said, why don't you have them number 1? And the reason I didn't have them number 1 was because loved all of their key returners, Hunter Dickinson, Dwan Harris, KJ Adams, those guys coming back. Looking at their transfer class, I think what Kansas was trying to do was correct, but my metrics that evaluated these players were not as high on them as most Kansas fans were. Most Kansas fans kind of thought that, AJ Storr was going to come in and be one of the top 15 or 20 transfers in the country. And, high hopes for Zeke Mayo. He's obviously been good. And Rylan Griffin as well. And I was just not as high on hardly any of those guys. I think I was still pretty optimistic about Rylan Griffin, but all of those guys were outside the top 20 in my transfer rankings in the offseason. Their transfer portal class, I only had ranked 19th in the country. And I think most people would have ranked Kansas's transfer portal class top 5, top 3, just because of Bill Self and those names coming in. And my models, I think they were looking for the right kinds of fits, but they just weren't as high on some of those guys as most people. And I think that's what we're sort of see playing out. If those transfers had been, that class had been top 5 in the country and that had, played out this season, I think Kansas would be more in that, upper echelon discussion with, Duke and Auburn and Iowa State. But because some of those guys, most of those guys haven't really quite panned out as fans were hoping, it's been a little bit below that.
It's kind of funny, actually, when you think about it, because, Kansas probably expected Zeke Mayo to be the least of the transfers coming in as far as impact goes. And now it's AJ Storr and Rylan Griffin have still kind of yet to get comfortable. Why do you think that is, Evan? Why do you think these transfers, particularly Storr and Griffin, are kind of taking a while to get themselves comfortable? And I think it's also worth noting here that Kansas fans, they want to see these two, Storr and Griffin, on the floor together. It hasn't happened a lot this season, but whenever it has happened, it's the third worst two-man combo for Kansas with 100-plus possessions. So what do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I wouldn't overreact to it too much, but I think there's a little bit of a different tale for both of these guys. For Rylan Griffin, I'm more optimistic. If you look at his stats, he averaged 26 minutes per game last year at Alabama, and he was a really good player. He's down to 18 this year, so his minutes are down. If you look at his per possession statistics in terms of shooting, in terms of rebounding, assist turnovers, all that stuff, it's pretty in line with what he did last year. He's just playing less, so his per game stats look down. His 3-point projection on my website is to shoot 37.3%, and that's exactly what he's shooting this year. So in terms of his 3-point shooting ability, which is a part of why this team got him, he's performing exactly as expected. So for me, I still have Griffin ranked fairly high on this team in terms of per possession value. I have him ranked 4th behind those big 3 returners in Dickinson, Harris, and KJ Adams. So I still have a lot of optimism about Griffin. I'd like to see him played more. For AJ Storr, I think it's a little bit of a different story, and part of why I did not have Storr ranked very highly in my transfer portal projections coming in was because Storr was an outstanding scorer at Wisconsin, but that's what he is. He's a volume scorer. He's not that efficient. He's a above average 3-point shooter. He's kind of an average 2-point shooter. He doesn't do great, or much better than average at the 3-point or at the stripe. And so really what his key ability is he can go get buckets. The problem is you've got other players on this team who also can get buckets, and so he wasn't going to immediately be the alpha on this team. The alpha on this team in terms of scoring is Hunter Dickinson. The player who's going to have the ball in his hands making plays is DeJuan Harris. And then you've got other guys like Zeke Mayo and KJ Adams who have key roles too. So I think it's just a little bit of a shift for him, coming off the bench in a lot of games and trying to figure out how to be sort of, honestly, I think kind of what you would hope for from him is kind of be like a Remy Martin type player who really provides that scoring when you kind of need it from somewhere, on your bench. But like that's a very different role for him. And so I think from that perspective, it's not surprising to me that he's struggled, and he's not really outside of scoring. He doesn't really profile great in any of those other areas. He has on my website, he has a C grade rebounding, a C plus playmaking, a C plus in terms of just overall court impact. So I think that kind of points to why he's been struggling a little bit.
And those right there, the rebounding and everything is what's going to get AJ Storr on the floor for especially a Bill Self-coach team. So pretty interesting to note. Something that is probably the most interesting that Kansas fans are going to want to get your take on is your tweet yesterday about Hunter Dickinson. Basically, everybody does claim he's a defensive liability. We've talked about it on this podcast. But you tweeted yesterday, there really is no statistical evidence to support this. I can pull up the exact on-off splits. I'll pull it up on the screen in the editing process here, but they're pretty good for Hunter Dickinson. Really what stands out is his freshman year at Michigan. He was pretty exceptional. And then this season, he's plus 6.2 in defensive on-off splits. Just kind of go into this take a little bit, Evan. And why you think Hunter Dickinson is actually not a defensive liability.
So there's a lot of different angles you can take to sort of evaluate how good a defensive player they are, right? You can look at their individual defensive stats, defensive rebounding, block steals. That does part of the job, but obviously that only gets so far, especially when you're talking about guards and defending other teams' players. Like those stats don't really tell the full story. But when you start with that, Hunter Dickinson is elite in most, if not all, of those categories. He has an A plus defensive rebounding grade on my website. That's top 10 in the country in terms of projected defensive rebounding. He's also 93rd percentile in blocks. He rarely fouls. So from that perspective, that looks good. If you're talking about Hunter Dickinson and you're trying to claim that he is a defensive liability, kind of the logic, at least to me, would say that when he's on the court, the team performs like worse than what they do when he's off the court. That's often kind of the language that we use around defensive liabilities. When you say someone is bad defensively, that means that you should take them off the court and play them less because they're a hindrance. And the reality is when you look at every single season of Hunter Dickinson's career, both at Kansas and at Michigan, his on-off splits, what that means is looking at how much better his team's defense has played per 100 possessions when he's on the court versus on the bench, adjusted for opponent strength. He's always better. The team is always better when he's on the court. And this has been one of his best seasons in that category. And so for me to see that consistency across 5 years, obviously that stat doesn't tell the whole story. It also, there a lot of context with who you're playing and all that stuff matters. But when you see the consistency across 5 years, that's pretty hard to do. And so for me, I just think the, pick and roll defense certainly is a weakness in his game. But I think when you're pointing to, okay, how much does it actually impact his overall impact on team defensive performance? I think it's a little bit overblown. I think he does a lot of other stuff really well. And, there's a lot of other things beyond just him that are potentially at fault for some of those plays where, he's sort of caught in that position. One other way of looking at this really quickly is just kind of overall the one metric I kind of point to predict defensive impact is defensive Bayesian performance rating on my website, which takes into account your individual defensive stats as well as your impact on team performance. And when you look at where he's ranked on his team every single year in that stat, he's first on the team this year, he was second on the team last year, and he was second on Michigan all 3 years he was at Michigan. So that's top 2 defender on your team every single year. I just don't see any proof there that, he's even shown 1 year where he's been a liability. And so I just think a lot of this sort of, Hunter Dickinson is a weak defender stuff is a bit much.
My only counter argument is that I guess, for the fans, at least what they're seeing is I think the mistakes are just so magnified. I think that's what the issue is. Like whenever Hunter Dickinson makes a mistake on the defensive end, you see it. And I'd be curious. Well, I'll check back with you, Evan, and maybe tweet something out about it. But I'm curious to see how Hunter Dickinson's defensive metrics kind of are in this time without KJ Adams. Because I also do think that KJ Adams being on that back line kind of helps him out a lot. Another thing with Hunter Dickinson, he's a top 5 player right now, I believe, on your website. Do you believe this, Evan? Do you believe that Hunter Dickinson is a top 5 player in college basketball this year?
Yes, I do. And part of what BPR does is it's not just saying body of work, how good you've been this year, but it's also predicting how good you're going to be going forward. I do believe Hunter Dickinson is a top 5 most valuable player in the country. And I think the only reason that he's not being talked about in that way more is just because he's been here for so long and he's not new. And, Hunter Dickinson's 45 or whatever. It's like people just want new stuff. Kansas fans want new stuff. Old people or other people who aren't Kansas fans who want to rag on Kansas. Hunter Dickinson is the perfect candidate to do that. But I think take away all of those like kind of biases away. He's a very good player. He's been consistently a good player for his whole career. And, I just really think that he is much better than people give him credit for. And I think a lot of that really just has to do with that people are tired of him. And that's fine. That's fine. But statistically, I still think he's very elite.
I want to get your thoughts on KJ Adams and kind of what he brings to this team because from the Kansas side, it seems like everybody who talks about Kansas wants to see KJ Adams play less. They maybe don't understand necessarily the value in playing him. I think after the Kansas State game, it became pretty clear what the value is in playing him. He is really good defensively and has Kansas' floor with KJ Adams defensively on the court is so much higher than whenever he's off the court. So what do you think about just kind of KJ Adams, his role? Is it worth sacrificing the offense for the defense? Just what do you think?
I think a lot of the narrative with KJ Adams is that from his freshman year, he has shown a lot of potential athletically. And so I really think Kansas fans have just been wanting to see that improvement, that potential realized. And when you have a year like this year where he's, significantly dipped in some key statistics, he's about a career 60% shooter from inside the arc, and he's only shooting at 50% now this year. You were just kind of hoping that would go the opposite direction, right? That he would be going better. But I think on the course of the season and the course of his career, I do think people should not overreact to, kind of this lack of progression and some of these weaknesses that we've seen. I still have him ranked third on the team in BPR behind Dickinson and Harris, which means, he's one of the three most important players to have on the floor. Statistically, in terms of his efficiency, I have him as the fourth best on the team, just in terms of his overall statistical individual profile. He's also fourth on the team in terms of adjusted team efficiency margin, which is basically measuring how good the team is playing while you're on the court. So he's top four in all of those categories. And he's got positive on-off splits, which we've talked about, especially on the defensive end. I think another interesting characteristic about Adams that maybe potentially is a bit underrated is that for a player who plays the four, he's a very solid playmaker. He's a B- on my website in projected assists, and he rarely turns the ball over. So when you have someone like that who's able to make plays for others with also without being kind of a weakness in giving the ball up, that's really valuable in a big man. And in terms of just projections, I still have him projected to shoot 60% from two going forward in his career. So I just don't think people should overreact. I do think he obviously brings a ton on the defensive end. I don't think offensively he's going to be maybe quite as bad as he has been, or at least people perceive it. So I still think he's a very important piece for this team.
I kind of want to get into some lineup combos now. It's my favorite tool on the website is looking at all that stuff. And Bill Self said after the Kansas State game that Flory Badunga and Hunter Dickinson, that combo is one of their best analytically, regardless of who's on the floor with them. It's a 123.0 offensive efficiency, 87.1 defensive with them together, plus 145, plus 45 and 126 offensive possessions, 124 defensive possessions. What do you just like about that duo specifically? And is this a duo that Kansas should be playing more often?
Yeah, just kind of looking at all of those duos that Kansas has, that one ranks third out of about 33 that have had that many possessions. So that's really good. And it also rates fairly high in my weighted chemistry metric, which kind of measures how much better those two players play together when they play individually. So that's really exciting. And I think it offers Kansas a new look that, maybe opponents aren't quite ready for or don't know how to handle. I really like this kind of mid-season tweaking. Obviously, some of that's based on injuries and whatnot. But just kind of having that in your back pocket is something that's really working and you can kind of employ going forward in the season, I think is really exciting. And so, yeah, I really like that a lot. And, people have mentioned too, when you have Badunga on the floor with Dickinson, you don't have to play Dickinson in quite the same way defensively, which is helpful. And so I definitely think that offers a lot of potential going forward, and I would love to see it more.
All right, another guy that appears on these two-man lineups. It looks like I think he's on all of the top 6 of them, the two-man lineups with 100-plus possessions. That's Shaquille Moore. If you go up to 3-man with 50-plus possessions, he's in all the top 6, besides the second best one that has Flory, Hunter, and DeJuan. And then, you bump it up to 4-man. He's in all of the top 4 bests besides one. And then he's in the best 5-man for Kansas with 50-plus possessions, and it's KU's starting lineup. DeJuan, Zeke, Shaquille Moore, KJ, and Hunter. Just how much has Shaquille Moore really added to this team as far as their value analytically? Because it seems like since he's been in there on Torvik, Kansas has the #1 defense since he's been inserted into the starting lineup. So what do you just think about the impact Shaquille Moore has had?
Yeah, I think the main thing to look at, especially on the defensive end, is, I mentioned this stat before, adjusted team efficiency margin. It measures how good the team has played with each player on the court adjusted for opponents. So when you sort that defensively, so looking at how many points per 100 possessions is Kansas giving up based on which players on the court, he's by far the best at 74 points per 100 that Kansas is giving up. The next closest is KJ Adams at 80. That's a big jump. I think the team average is around 83 or 84. So you're talking about a guy who, when he's on the court, especially recently with the minutes that he's been playing, the defense has been incredibly better. And obviously, offensively, he's not going to be the brightest star on the team or anything. But when you're talking about a player who adds that much value defensively, it's kind of hard to keep him off the court. I love that he's playing more. And another sign of this, too, is that when you look at lineups on my website, one of the things I do is not just look at how good the lineup has performed, but also how good it's predicted to do going forward. The lineup with Harris, Mayo, Shaq, Badunga, and Dickinson is now the number one lineup in terms of predicted efficiency margin going forward. That's how good that lineup has been. And it's only that lineup particularly has only played about 30 possessions, but looking at how good it's played and the individual skills of that lineup and the fact that Moore has moved himself into that spot, despite the fact that I think he's only still sixth on the team in BPR, I think really points to that unit particular works really well. And what they've been doing recently has been a harbinger for success.
I want to see some more of that, Evan. I want to see some more of that. All right. I want to ask about these keys to victory / the key metrics report. I'll admit I'm fresh out of college. I got no full-time job. I can't necessarily afford the premium. But if you would, could you kind of go into that and what that section looks like for Kansas?
Yeah, so the Keys to Victory tool on my website for premium subscribers, basically what it looks at is you can kind of break down a team's performance either this year or over the last several years based on any number of statistical categories and kind of figure out what are the specific metrics for a given team that really means that they're going to be successful versus not successful. And so, for example, this year, one of the keys that it automatically finds for Kansas is that a big key for them this year has been 2-point shooting. They are 9-0 this year when shooting over 52% from two, and they're beating opponents by 24 points per game. On the other side of that, when they shoot under that mark of 52%, they're just 4-4, and they're basically, beating opponents by a half a point. So that has been a huge difference for them in terms of, are you reliably scoring from inside the arc? 3-point shooting can be a lot more variable game to game, but that has been a big one for them on the course of this season specifically, and something to kind of watch going forward for this team. Can they hit over that 52%, or, if you're just talking more generally, make more than half of their shots from two? I think that's really been a big key for them this year. And so certainly something to watch going forward.
Thank you for that insight, Evan. I appreciate that. I want to ask about kind of Kansas's identity right now, right? Kansas kind of leaning into that defensive identity, but I think we've seen just across college basketball the past few seasons that offense is getting some of these teams to the deeper runs. So I ask you, can Kansas lean into this defensive identity to make a run here, or do you think they need to kind of get this offense figured out a little bit?
I think it's some of both. I think the fact that Kansas has a top 5 defense in the country right now, I have them third in predicted defensive efficiency. When you have a defense that good and you're able to slow opponents down like that, you can kind of change any game, because even the best offensive teams are going to struggle a lot more than they normally do against you. And often, like what people say, defense can lead to offense. And so especially when you have Bill Self at the helm here, you do have a lot of faith that offensively he's going to get things figured out. So if you can rely on your defense, I think that's huge. It also points to the effort being there too, which is often something that if you have teams on the flip side who are great offensively and struggle defensively, sometimes it's just a matter of these guys just aren't willing to put in the work. That's not true of this team. This team is definitely willing to put in the work. So I do think the fact that you have a top 5 defense, if you can kind of keep it that way profile-wise going into the tournament and see a little bit of offensive improvement, I think this team has the ingredients to, make a Final Four, if not further.
All right, well, now I'm going to ask you to predict. I'm going to ask you kind of, to predict what's going on for this Kansas team. First thing, where do you think they finish in the Big 12? Then I'll ask kind of what seed you think they'll get. And then ultimately, where does this team end up? Is it a first weekend exit, Sweet 16, Final Four? What are you thinking? Call your shots here a little bit.
So right now, I think bracketology resume-wise, Kansas is kind of hovering around being one of the best 3 seeds in the tournament. I think if I had to predict, given the fact that I think they are strength-wise the third best team in the Big 12 behind Houston and Iowa State, and I have them as a top 7 team in the country, I do think probably the most likely seed for them is being a 2 seed. I think they'll probably move their way up there if I had to guess. 2 or 3 seed, definitely the most likely. I feel like 1 is out of the question. I really doubt this team would play bad enough to be a 4 seed. So my prediction would be that 2 or 3 range if I really had to put a pin on it. I think a 2 seed, and probably finishing third in the Big 12.
Gotcha. What do you think? End up? Where do they end up?
In the tournament, you mean?
Yeah, in the tournament.
I definitely, if I had to pick right now, I'd probably pick Elite Eight. I think I would be shocked if they didn't make a Sweet 16. I just really have a lot of confidence in them. I have a lot of confidence in Bill Self to rebound after last year. I'm not picking them all the way to the Final Four, at least right now, but I think they're good enough to make an Elite Eight, and so that's my pick.
I think I'm with you there. I think most Kansas fans, with kind of how the season has played out so far, some of the pieces not exactly fitting. An Elite Eight run, I think you kind of take that as Kansas fans. If you get to the Final Four down there in San Antonio, I think you're pretty ecstatic as a Kansas fan. All right, Evan, I really appreciate you for coming on the hum today. That is all we have for you guys. We will see you after this TCU game, and then we'll end up previewing Houston, probably with a national guy as well. So that's all we have for you today. Thank you again, Evan, for joining us. We will see